Hello ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Martin McPhillamy, owner of Performance Through Health, and I am a specialist in breathing, sleep and stress. And in this video today, we're going to talk about the control of breathing and the breath cycle, both at rest, during exercise and sleep, to distinguish how they differ. Now, for someone like me who takes people through reprogramming their breathing from dysfunctional, stressed out patterns to functional, efficient breathers, this is important when considering reprogram their breathing. Because people can come with inefficient breathing and not even realize. If you think of today's world, how stressed out, how fast we are, and how many people actually lack exercise and are immobile, when they then go to actually do some form of movement, they get short of breath and just assume they're unfit. But what about if their breathing is just not efficient? Or say, for example, if someone has poor sleep quality and they wake up often, that could snoring or airway resistance could be waking them up. And that could be due to poor breathing. So what I do is I help people reprogram their breathing. So in a moment, we're going to talk about how our breath is controlled. We're going to go through rest to begin with. But let's just talk about a little bit about anatomy, and then we'll go into what happens when we actually breathe. So obviously we've got the nose, the air flows through the turbinates, where that actually slows the flow down. Slows the flow down to allow cleaning to occur, humidify the air, either warm the air or they cool the air, depending on the environment outside. But that allows for, once it gets into our alveoli, to be at the ideal temperature for gas exchange. The air passes through the sinus cavities, which picks up nitric oxide, and then it goes down into the trachea, bronchi, bronchioles, and into the conducting zones, the alveoli, where gas exchange occurs. But how does this actually happen? So at rest, in our brain, we have a central pattern generator called the pre-Botzinger complex. Now that innervates and sends signals down to our diaphragm and our external intercostal muscles. So the diaphragm contracts, flattens. The external intercostal muscles pull the ribcage up, and that creates more volume within our lungs. Now, if we talk about Boyle's law for a second, Boyle's law basically means that for a gas at any given temperature, the volume is equal to the inverse of the pressure. So the greater pressure, the less volume. Imagine you have a bottle and you have the lid slightly off, you squeeze that, add some pressure, the volume inside the bottle is going to decrease. The lungs are the same. However, the lungs are also elastic, and that's something we have to take into consideration. So at rest, in our breath cycle, we have 3 sections. You think it might be 2, but there's actually 3. The inhale, which is active, it requires energy because it requires our diaphragm and intercostals to open up. And then there's a post-inhalation phase. This occurs because the body is still trying to ensure the lungs stay open, especially at the alveoli, and that the gas conducting zones remain open. Now, because all these small little alveoli that are in our lungs, mostly at the base, but they are scattered throughout, they have a very large surface area. If you were to open up the lungs and to lay out the alveoli, it's probably about the size of half a tennis court. Pretty significant, put into one zone. As that stretches, you've got fibers between the little small sacs, and these are elastic. They're elastins, proteins. So as you stretch, just like an elastic band, you have a energy potential, stored energy potential created, elastic energy potential. So as soon as a signal is stopped and prevented, there's an inhibition, and all of a sudden the lungs will just slowly to begin with, and then they'll just relax. And it's just a recoil, essentially. So what tends to happen is during one breath cycle is that you have at rest, it's just a active phase, followed by a slower active phase, followed by a relaxing phase. So when we when we breathe typically, it should be a faster, deeper inhale, followed by a prolonged, longer exhale, and there's a slight pause. And then the pre-Botzinger complex will innervate that again. And that is generally just on a pattern. It is dictated by, to a certain extent, our peripheral chemoreceptors, which monitor carbon dioxide and blood pH mostly. As a part of breaking down energy, a byproduct of that, or aerobic oxidation, a byproduct of that is carbon dioxide. Now, carbon dioxide gets picked up by these peripheral chemoreceptors, and that stimulates more breathing. So if you were to just take a breath now and just pinch your nose, CO2 is going to start to rise. You're going to get a stronger urge to breathe. That urge to breathe actually comes from changes in acidity, but mostly from carbon dioxide. At rest, that's just generally going up and down. It's a general pattern. Okay. Now, it only really takes roughly 1 millimeter of mercury increase in arterial carbon dioxide from 40, say, to 41 to increase ventilation by 40%. From roughly 500 milliliters per breath, 10 breaths, about 5 liters, increasing to around about 7 liters. So it's quite significant. What about if you start to exercise? Now, if you start to exercise, obviously you're going to have more energy requirements in the muscles, in the cells. You're going to get greater oxidative breakdown of the energy. So as exercise starts to increase, we do get an increase in ventilation. This increase in ventilation, typically at the beginning of exercise, just comes from changing the depth of breathing, which we call tidal volume. So why is that? Well, if you imagine that trying to get air in and out of the lungs, there's a gap between the nose and the gas exchange parts of the lungs. This is called dead space. So if you're to increase frequency but not depth, all you're doing is just getting air in and out like this. So it's not actually getting deeper into the lungs for gas exchange, but really you want to be able to get the O2 to produce the energy and the CO2 out. So the body is evolved and adapted to say, okay, well, we need to increase gas exchange first. But there's a point within our lungs, because the lungs are elastic. Imagine pulling an elastic band, it gets tighter and tighter and tighter, it gets more rigid. There's an increased work as we get to a certain point. And that's usually around about 50 or 60% of our vital capacity, the amount of air we can shift in and out of our lungs, that the body would go, work of breathing's too much, we're no longer efficient, so we're going to start to increase our breathing rate. Now, there's a certain point during exercise where the intensity becomes too challenging, that we have to switch over into anaerobic glycolysis. It's less efficient. It means we're not taking oxygen, but we're still producing energy. But as a result, there's a significant amount of CO2 rising, acid reduces, and this is where most people will switch over to mouth breathing to offload more CO2. And all of a sudden, ventilation will increase even faster by breathing rate. Now, elite athletes and people who can train really hard and can push themselves can reach a third point that changes in their breathing. This is known as the respiratory compensation point, and this is where the breathing is just basically as fast as possible. Now, if any of you have heard of the likes of Brian McKenzie, Jason Donaldson, Shift Adapt, Power Speed Endurance, they talk about a gearing system, and it's this process of having gears, gear 1, 2, and 3 before what we call the ventilatory threshold or lactate threshold, switching over into anaerobic. We then switch over to nasal and mouth breathing, and at the very top in gear 5, just like a car, we switch over to mouth breathing to ensure that we can stabilize and start to help bring down our CO2 levels because the muscle fatigues under acidity. So what actually happens with the breath cycle in exercise? So obviously we want to offload more CO2. We want to increase the depth of breathing, and we want to force more air out faster. So no longer is the outwards phase, the expiration phase, relaxing. Is it just an inhibition? The ventral paraphageal nucleus, a different part of within our brainstem in the medulla oblongata, actually then activates the rectus abdominis and the internal obliques and the internal intercostal muscles to contract and help pull the chest down, which generates more pressure, which gets more air out. So then it goes to a two-phase cycle, an inspiration followed by an expiration. Now, if you think about it, what can happen is in some individuals who, if they breathe too fast and their expiratory part of that breath cycle is shortened too much, the inhale will be longer than the exhale. So as someone starts to fill up, they get something called hyperinflation. Their breathing becomes inefficient and people start to get tight-chested. Airways resistance, asthma. It's inefficient for gas exchange, you're just going to fatigue out. What about sleep? Sleep's an interesting one. So in sleep, we have two phases. We've got REM sleep and non-REM sleep. Now in non-REM sleep, there's 3 stages, 1, 2, and 3. The deeper we go, the more relaxed our body is, and the more parasympathetic activity we get going on. So in non-REM sleep, breathing actually is suppressed because metabolically we just don't need the demand. There's less CO2 involved. However, in REM sleep, when we're paralyzed, our chemoreceptors are actually deactivated, and we're no longer breathing from changes in the biochemistry. So that ventral parafacial nucleus actually begins to activate in REM sleep to help the breathing cycle continue. So we still have the inhalation phase, but then we're actually getting an active expiration phase to ensure that CO2 continues to expel during sleep, because if we get an increase in CO2 in sleep time, we'll go into a coma and potentially die. So it's interesting that we can look at these 3 phases of our breath, and then if someone has a dysfunctional pattern, say for example they have stress, they have anxiety, or they have breathing issues related to sport, then we can look at these 3 phases and we can look to how to improve their breathing. Thanks for tuning in, guys. So if you enjoyed this episode or you have any questions, if that made anything pop up, I'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment below. In the comment section, I'm also going to put some free video training in there. It's my free breath mastery training that's going to help individuals that are stressed to reprogram their breathing. It's going to take them through the 5 steps to reduce stress by 50%, boosting focus, energy, and productivity. And people are going through this process, and really it's life-changing sort of stuff. So click the link below, check it out, have a look, and don't forget to subscribe. Appreciate you all for watching.